Today's scripture reading comes from the book of 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 through 10, and 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 5 through 12. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. And then 2 Corinthians 9, 5 through 12. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance for the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not an exaction. The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that, having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. As it is written, He has distributed freely, He has given to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way to be generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, we're really moving along in our service today. This is great. We're going to do something special. This is actually the part 4 and the last message of our brief series on stewardship. And this will also be the first Sunday where we're going to give you a chance in responsive time. So let me invite, when I go to the closing prayer of the sermon, I'm going to invite our praise team to come up and then lead us in some music. And we're going to invite you to have a chance to pray over this. And if you feel that you're ready, to be able to give your pledge, okay? But let's get into today's message. Part 1. The temptation and trap of desiring to be rich. How do you like that? Is there a person in this room who desires to be rich? Let me ask the question a little differently. Is there a person not in this room who does not desire to be rich? So I can venture to say that for everybody in this room, and probably 99.9% of the people who are going to ever listen to this message on YouTube or on our podcast, we fall into this category. We desire to be rich. The Bible has very serious warnings about that there's a temptation and there's a trap. And we're going to talk about that, okay? Part 2, enriched in every way. That's the way I kind of want us to kind of close out this portion, is I want you to think about what it means to be really enriched. Because if you're going to have some kind of real control and actual self-control about money and about worldly wealth and material goods, you have to think differently about what it means to be enriched, okay? And I think that's it. Only 2 parts today, okay? So before I get into part 1, though, I want to do a very brief review of stewardship. So I talked about this last week, and let me just go through this just very, very, very quickly, okay? So first of all, what is stewardship? What does it mean to be a steward? Jesus teaches this, and it's not only just a concept out of the Bible, but let me give you it's a very direct and not a hard concept to understand. It's managing goods that belong to someone else. Managing goods that belong to someone else. And really, it's the activity of your whole life. All Christians are stewards, okay? Because, let's go to the next slide, because it isn't 10% of your wealth and of your goods that belong to God, it's actually 100%. Actually, all that you own and you yourself, okay? All of you belongs to God through Jesus Christ if you surrender your life over to Him. And actually, that's the best place to be. If your life belongs to Him, everything of you, do you really want only 95% of you to belong to Him? You're like, okay, the parenting doesn't belong to Him. I guess I'm on my own to run that. Do you really want that to be the case? Don't you want all your gifts, all your time, that includes all your money, also to belong to Him? So it sounds like, since we always think about this has to be mine, this is yours. And so the mine part is the part that we all care about, right? It's very strange. God is very, very generous to say, this is yours, but really, if you should understand, it's actually mine, okay? The next thing I want to emphasize here is we want you to think about this. I know that this could, for some of you, this is wild, but we want you to willingly decide to move to our tithe. Willingly decide to move to tithing. And tithing is, it's this very ancient practice of giving 10% of your goods to the Lord, 10% of your income to the Lord. And I talked about this last week. 10% might sound like a lot, but it's actually less than the government asks, okay? And it's not intended to be a burden. It's intended to be not even about money. I said this last week. It's not even really about money. It's about trust, because God doesn't need your money. Okay? Honestly, God's not really that interested in your money. And so, it's really fundamentally about trust. It's a number that's large enough that fundamentally it'll require that you trust that God provides for you. But it's not so big that it's intended to burden you or intended to stress you. Now, if you've never really learned how to handle your material goods this way, it could feel like a piece of stressor and wow, this feels like a heavy burden that the church is asking us to do. And we're not trying to exact money out of you. It says, that's what the pastor says, right? Not an exaction. We are very, very serious about that. So I said this last week. Let's say you're a person that gives 3% to the Lord. That's what you've always done, 2%, 3%. And now you're like, whoa, I got to jump to 10%. Hey, you might not be ready to do that right away, and we're not going to try to exact it out of you. That's not the purpose of this. What we're asking you to do is to grow in trust. To grow in trust. To do it willingly, cheerfully, that you would do it gladly, so you can grow in trust, and you really can find out that God provides for you, and you willingly can find out that it's really, really good when He's Lord of all of your wealth, okay? And so the last point here, so I said this last week, not stingy, which is what we typically tend to be. We tend to not want to give because we don't want to be generous because we just care about my stuff out of selfishness. And nor do we want you to be self-righteous. So sometimes people hit to that I got the 10%. I'm a good Christian, you're not, right? And so you walk around as if you're some kind of superior human being when everything that we have received is by grace. We did not receive salvation or the love of God or the grace of God because we deserved it. In fact, we deserved quite the opposite. So, we actually would love for you to be challenged. If you get to especially a lot of wealth, and it's actually not hard for you to give 10% to the Lord, you might want to start thinking, all right, well, maybe we should get 12% or 15%. Or the person that kind of blows me away is Pastor Rick Warren. He does this thing that he calls reverse tithing. Do you know what he means by that? He gives 90% of what he makes to the Lord, and he only lives on 10%. So he started doing that when his book became international bestseller, and he said that just scared the heck out of him, and he started making crazy amounts of money. And so he and his wife said, we don't really need all this money. Let's reverse tithe. So tithing is not even fundamentally about 10%. You see what I'm saying? It's about loving the Lord and really letting Him have all of you, okay? So, but we're not asking you to give 90%, so don't worry about that, okay? So we're just asking you to think about what this means before God, and that you would go willingly and cheerfully be generous through faith and grace through the gospel, okay? All right, that's the review. Let's go to part 1. The temptation and trap of desiring to be rich. Some of you are probably already getting a little nervous, okay? But here, let me just say this first. I hope you don't hear any of this message as a piece of judgment. I literally know no soul, like I said as I started this message, there's not a person in America that I've ever met who doesn't want to be rich. Okay, I mean, I shouldn't say there's some strange, weird person. Like my grandmother didn't care about being rich, okay? She was really strange, okay? But like all my aunts and uncles did. my parents did. You know, my parents are godly people, okay? My parents are godly people. They clearly wanted to be rich. It's one of the reasons why we moved to America. So every culture loves money, but not like Americans. If you come to America, or if you're American, we want to be rich. We expect to be rich, probably more than any other country in the world, and maybe more than any other country that's ever been on this planet. We are crazy. So this passage I'm going to preach on, I've actually rarely ever heard it preached in America because it's a direct attack on American values. It's absolutely just undermines the American way, because the American way is everybody wants to be rich, which is, the Bible warns us, there's a lot of problems here, okay? So let's get into it, to verse 6. Godliness with contentment. Now, that sounds a little strange. Is there such a thing as godliness without contentment? I think so. I just told you my parents are godly people, but they wanted to be rich. I would say for most of the time I was growing up, they were godly, but were they content with the amount of money that they made? Totally not. They worked really, really hard. They had godliness without contentment. Now, there's a lot of us, we don't even have godliness, okay? So we're like, no, we lack contentment, anxiety, greed, covetousness. That's like the total norm. We wake up, this is what we care about, right? And we're like, godliness, that's pretty low. I wouldn't say that that's kind of a bucket that describes me. But here's the thing I want you to get, godliness with contentment. My parents did, over time, start to learn contentment. You know how I started to see it? Because they started becoming more generous. And they just stopped worrying about trying to get more money. It's like, it's strange. And you know what? They started becoming happier people. Godly already. But there's a lot of gain. But I just want to just put this. Godliness with contentment. Lots of Christians have godliness at varying levels. Most American Christians do not have contentment when it comes to worldly wealth. No, that's a really small percentage, okay? Verse 7, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. That sounds like the most obvious thing in the world to say, okay? But do you know that just every religious worldview after another, there are certain like ancient religions, and not even just ancient religions, where people would die, and then all their jewelry and their fancy stuff would end up in the coffin with them. You know, you ever heard this guy like King Tut of Egypt? Like when they opened up his tomb, there was unbelievable wealth in there, because in his mind, he's like, if you put it in the tomb, I'll get to take it with me. Sorry about that. That's not how it works. So just first, I want you to just, I don't want to just pass this verse, even though, I just know this. Why are you talking about this, Pastor? We live and act as if we're going to accumulate all this goods. The money, like a big number in the bank account, and then whatever your fancy clothes that you have, and whatever fancy car that you think you're going to have, and somehow we think it matters when we die, right? It won't. It won't. Maybe what you did with it, but you can't take any of it with you. So it's a very just plain thing to say, but whatever you gain in this world, it's only kind of valuable for this world. It's not for very long. It's not for very long at all. Now, many of you in this church, one of my friends visited, one of my friends from college visited with her mom last week. I was completely floored when she came, by the way. Her comment was, there's a lot of young people in this church. So a lot of you young people in your 20s and younger, and even younger than that, you think your life is long, okay? But I'm just going to warn you right now, It's not. I mean, I'm in my early 50s, and I remember when I was your age. Like, I don't remember it like it was like some long distant thing in the past. There are days I remember from when I was 20 or 21, like literally when my college friends showed up, like all these memories of like what I was like when I was 21 or 22, where like they were just in me like it was yesterday, but it was more than 30 years ago, okay? So you think you got all this time and you got this long life and you're going to build all this wealth. Well, let me tell you something. Your life is moving along quickly. Will you build true riches? Will you seek true riches? Okay? Verse 8. If we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. Every time I've read that verse, I said, every American Christian does not agree with that verse, okay? We say we believe in the Bible, but like every American Christian, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 12, we do not believe in that. If we have food and clothing, we will not be content. We'll be so not content because we have to have more food and more clothing, and then after you have more clothing, you need more clothing. Okay, you know, my family's not very rich. Do you know how many pair of shoes that my wife has? And we're not rich. Do you know how many pair of shoes that my daughter has? And we're not, okay, he's not here today, but you know, my foster son. My foster son, well, he's poor, okay? But you know how many pair of shoes he has? Far more than he can wear. Which I, like, when I look at how much his clothing, if you ask me what he's rich in, it's shoes. And I look at that and go, okay, interesting, okay? We are not content with even one kind of article of clothing, shoes. There has to be just so many different kinds, right? Because it has to match all these different things and blah, 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 right? So I want to ask you about this question, content. Are you content? I know the answer is probably no. If you're honest, the answer is no. I'm not even going to just ask you just content in the big generic way. Just pick one bucket. Are you content with your car? Are you content with your house? Are you content with your shirts? Are you content with your stock account? Whatever it is that's your material goods, do you have contentment? I'll tell you one place I'm content, okay? So, and this is actually a little bit of an achievement. It's my socks. You know, if I get some new socks, fine. And if I don't, fine. I really don't care, and I'm happy with the socks I own, including the ones that are a little frayed. You know what that was like? I was like, oh, that's contentment. It's actually contentment. That's strange. That's contentment. And I'm a professional Christian, and in my clothing, I'm not a big clothing person. I would say probably like half my clothing I have contentment with, half my clothing I don't. Interesting, isn't it? Like I recently bought some new pants, and it was like I bought Gap khakis, okay? Because I just think they're the best. And it's really painful because the owner of Gap is John Fisher, and he's the owner of the A's, and he is the person in the Bay Area I dislike absolutely the most, okay? So I was like, oh, I just enriched John Fisher. But those pants are so good, and I like the price, and I like how they fit. It produced contentment. I was like, oh, this is the trade-off. I have to enrich a person I think is horrible, but I'll have contentment. I choose contentment. But we don't have it in many places, do we? Oh, no, we don't. All right, verse 9. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires. So let's just stop there. There's like 3 buckets there. Temptation, a snare, that's not really a word that we tend to use today, and senseless and harmful desires. What's the temptation? The temptation is, so let's think about it. There's someone who's going to tell you something. It's typically a promise. they're tempting you to do this, and that promise is probably at best a half-truth, or it's just a total falsity. Let me tell you what the temptation sounds like. You don't actually say this out loud. Most Americans don't say this out loud, but almost every American believes in some variation of this. Money is the only sure source of happiness, treasure, and security in this world. I've literally had older adults say something exactly like that. I have pastored people who come to church, they believe in Jesus, and then if they want to take their relationship to Jesus more seriously, and so that means they're like willing to get like a B+ average, and then not have to go to some top school. You know what their parents, their supposedly godly parents, tell them? You got to make money. And you won't make much money unless you get into that school, unless you get these grades. These are the godly people, supposedly. You know how many young people I've heard tell me that their parents say that to them? So what's happening is their parents is telling them the temptation lie that we already have. And that thing is like this giant thing inside of our heart, and it's getting in the way of a lot of problems. It's getting in the way of a lot of things. So that's the first thing, temptation. 2, a snare. Let's use a little bit more of a modern word that we would use, which is trap. A snare is a trap. Right now, we hear this little animal scurrying around in our house. So, like I had to go and buy this rat trap, okay? It's about this big. It's serious business. And then I put like peanut butter on this rat trap because apparently peanut butter works. And while I was setting this thing, I was like, well, this thing is dangerous. Like, if it snaps on my hand, I'm going to get hurt. So of course it's going to break a rat's neck. Okay? Why am I talking to you about that? The desire to be rich is just like that. Except it's not peanut butter. It's not peanut butter. It's that you'll be rich, you'll be secure, you'll be happier, you'll be able to get whatever it is that you care about, right? That awesome Mediterranean cruise, you can go on that every single year, right? That's in the middle of your trap. What's in your trap? The money lie, that promise, that's the bait inside the trap. And if you have this desire to be rich, that's the bait that the devil is going to put in your trap. For some people, it's actually security. So I've noticed this. There are Christians who are not generous, and they're rather frugal, so they don't waste their money. They go, we don't blow our money, we don't waste our money, and that actually becomes strangely a kind of self-righteousness. They look at other people who buy like fancy clothes or cars, and they're like, I'm not like them, worldly like them, but what they do is they sock all their money away because they live out of fear. Out of fear. Fear that this is the thing that will make me secure. So again, the money is a promise of security, and the security is the bait inside the trap. Let's go to the next. Those who desire to be rich and fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires. Let's go to the next slide. That plunge people into what? Ruin and destruction. Do you think that sounds like exaggerated? Or like some kind of strange preacher scare tactic? So, I told you about temptations, I told you about snares. The temptation and the snare, it's based on senseless and harmful desires. I told you at the center of the trap is your desires. And So it's not going to be this like arm that like snaps you on top of your neck and kills you like a rat, but instead it'll break your life in a way that you didn't want, in ways that there's just costs. So what are some of the ways that like people end up in ruin? Let me just talk about this. So I'll just give you two that are really common, like incredibly common. So the first one, let me address the men first. Almost every man I know, he gets to like, that career place, and you know what he thinks about all the time? His work. And he wants to be really good at his work, but the underlying thing under the work is money. It's about money. You chop up, you get more rewards, you get better at your work, you get more rewards. What if you were to work really hard, and then your company would give you a promotion, but then give you much money? Would you want to take that promotion? Probably not, because deep down the underlying reward is the money. Not always. Sometimes we like the pride of like having like that higher position. But that's really interesting too. People don't think about that as money, but it's something that money gives you. It's money gives you too. That could be in the center of the rat trap too. So, men think, okay, I got married, I have children, I want to send them to this school and that school, we got to get them like coding classes, and I got to send them to Chinese school, or whatever language you care about. Chinese school, Korean school, Tamil school, okay? And then I got to send them to this college, I got to get them, this camps and all this kind of stuff. We want to give everything to our kids. It seems absolutely reasonable, right? So, that's what the man tells himself. Everything that he's working for is to do it for his kids. But everything that he's supposed to provide for his kids is about money. So then he spends all his time and energy and like 80, 90% of his waking thoughts thinking about that. And then you know what he does? He's not very attentive to his wife. He's doing this to love his kids. Does he have a relationship to his kids? Do you talk to your kids? Do you know how to connect to your kids? Do you talk to your kids about Jesus, for instance? The amount of time that most men think about money versus say, who is my relationship with Jesus, and then how do I like to impart that to my own kids? Well, that gets a lot, that's really low energy and pretty low priority. So this is how men operate in their 20s and in their 30s. Some of the men wake up in their 30s. Most don't. They get into their 40s, and then the kids are grown up, or at least 16, 17, and now they're not listening to you. You've habituated not paying attention to your wife, not getting close to her because you just work really, really hard. At the end of the day, you're just exhausted. It's just Netflix, ESPN time, or whatever you like to do to click out. If you're extra bad, it's probably porn or something like that. So the money enslavement, control, runs your life, and then it costs you marriage, your parenting. Now, if you're lucky, you won't get divorced, but you'll just only have to go to marital counseling. 10, maybe 12 years into your marriage. If you're lucky, your kids won't hate you or ignore you or forget about you. So there's a lot of men that get to a certain age and they're thinking, that didn't turn out great. That didn't turn out great. My relationship with my kids, you know what they would say? If they were honest, they would call it ruin. It's a pretty honest word. I would say that's ruin. Sometimes they would say, my marriage, yeah, it ended. Destruction. My wife wanted more of me, but I was too busy thinking about the money. It's actually strange because sometimes when the wife wants more of him, and then he feels like she's nagging him. She's nagging me. Don't you see how much I love you? Don't you see how hard I work? And of course you do work hard. But where's the balance? Where's your wife feel like, I'm kind of like, I clearly take second place to the job, don't I? So, I'm going to give you a little piece of wisdom here. If you're married today, I want you to ask your wife, do you take second place to work and money? Do you feel like in my heart, that you, as my wife, get second place to work and money? And then shut up and listen to the answer. Do not pressure her. Make it absolutely safe. She can say the absolute truth and hear it. And if she says, I have to honestly say, I do feel like I'm in second place, you're in the trap. Okay, men? I don't say this to you to be mean. I'm helping you to avoid destruction and ruin. Okay? Okay, ladies, it's your turn. Okay, oh, by the way, all of you young men who aren't married yet, that was a giant warning, okay? That was a giant warning about like how you should think about your, hopefully you'll get married in your 30s, your 40s are going to look loud. Like, so think about this, and you can begin to think about stewardship today and not being owned by money today, and it can reshape your future and your relationship to your wife and your kids, okay? Let me talk about the trap to the women that I see. And so this one's painful, and let me just frame this. Ladies, if any of you fall into what I'm about to describe next, I know sometimes I could say things rather directly. I want to say this gently, okay? I know this is really, really painful to a lot of women. It's painful that we generally don't talk about it. The women don't talk about it. So of course the men don't talk about it. But this is what the Bible teaches. So I'm going to step into this. But I don't do it to hurt you, okay? So this is as common as can be today. The women choose their career, their major, and their career first. They get into their early 20s. They habituate thinking about their career and their money. They're 25, 27, 28. Some of them are still doing it when they're 30. And they assume, it's an assumption based on pure faith, but it's a faith in nothing because it's not real, which is, I'm going to, of course, meet a husband, and we're going to have great kids, and I'm going to have a wonderful family. But you know what? For so many women, it doesn't turn out that way. And why are so many women thinking about their career and stuff like, well, because you went to college, because you're really smart and you're really talented, and you went to college, and everything in our culture is about making money, right? Everything in our culture is if you're a successful adult, you make money. Get rich. In fact, even your immigrant parents, they want even their daughters to do that too, not just their sons. So you're being a good girl, you graduate college, it's career time, right? But there is such a thing as marriage market. It's not fair, but men are more attractive when they get older, especially if they have money. But women, how much you make in your bank account is actually not really the measure that most men will think about whether they want to marry you or not. So actually, if you really want the husband and the kids, that actually probably needs to be the thing you should think about. Not desiring to be rich, not the career and the money. It's really interesting. I'll tell you a stat which completely shocked me. So I was listening to, I forget the guy's name. He's a big data expert, global data. He studied fertility, how many women are having babies, and he's studied all the developed nations, their fertility rate, how many babies they're having, right? And so he's studied the problems in all these different countries. And I think this was the Jordan Peterson podcast, okay? And so I was this is a really interesting discussion. He says if a woman hasn't had one child, hasn't given birth to a child by the time she's 30 years old, so this is an absolutely shocking stat, by the time she's 30 years old, she actually has a higher chance of having 0 children than 1 child. Let me say it again. A woman, if she hasn't had one baby by the time she's 30 years old, she actually has like about a 52, 51% chance of having 0 kids than even having 1 kid. That's the global data. And 90-something% of women, they want a husband, they want to have kids. But if you choose money to desire to be rich, this could be a cost. And if some of you are already at that place and you're like, I don't know if I can have babies, I already ended up in this place. I want to say to you, first of all, I'm sorry to talk about this. It's a painful thing, I know. I know so many people, it's incredibly painful. But the second thing I want to say is, if you've been in that place, God still has a plan for you, ladies. Sometimes women marry late, and then somehow they have babies. Okay, I mean, I'm praying for somebody right now, she's in her 40s, to have her 2nd child. Okay? Like, anytime somebody tells me that we're trying to have a baby and they're in their 40s, I just put them on my regular prayer list. Right? But sometimes I've met women who decide to adopt. We're in the foster parenting community now. I'm meeting older women who didn't have any biological children of their own, and then they adopted. Okay? Or they're in the foster system. I think it's beautiful. So there can be pieces of just a lot of pain and disappointment. And by the way, these are just the two big ones, but there's so many more. So I want you to think very seriously about what it means that there could be a trap if so much of your life is about trying to make a lot of money, okay? Let's skip the next one. Let's go to part 2. Let's just go ahead to part 2. Oh, yeah, that's all right. Let's go to part 2. Enriched in every way. I'm going to give you these verses, and I'm going to say these verses to you, and after I close out the sermon, we're going to have a time of responsive prayer, okay? And while we are in this time of responsive prayer, these verses are the ones I want in your mind. In fact, I hope these are the verses that won't just be in your mind today, but that like every single week when you come to church and you want to give offering, you actually remember these verses. And when you start paying your bills, I hope you remember these verses. These are words from God. These are unbelievable words from God. And if your heart and your habits in your life can start to move into this place, it will free you from the traps of the world. It'll free you from the lies of the world. It'll free you from all the anxiety and worries that you have that like maybe my life could go sideways. And the fears. So much of our life in 21st century Silicon Valley is built on fear. It's built on fear about money. But if you have a real God, a real Father, who really provides for you like these words say, and if you can get to the place where you really trust in that, and you can begin to handle your money so that it's not your happiness, it's not your security, it's not your salvation, it's not your identity, it's not like this thing that makes you feel like you're a good person, right? So many things in your life, just think about it. Like, so pick something that you bought recently that you liked. I mean, we're going to all shop now. It's December, right? And so get something that you like. I'll tell you something about I recently. You see this watch right here? Last year, one of the brothers in my discipleship group gave me, he gifted all the brothers the cheapest version of this smartwatch. I never had one. So I tried it for a while, and then I said, okay, I'm going to blow some money to get the better version. And then I asked my kids to get it for me. So they paid for it, and I really like it. I really like using it. But you know what? Here's what happened. And you guys all know this is what happens. After about 3 or 4 months, like the shine of the, this is so cool. Yeah. That happy little drug that you get from the new thing, after 3 or 4 months, what happens? And it goes away. So you know how often I mess around with my watch now? Not that much. I like it. I like it, but it's already starting to get boring. It's already starting to get boring. It's only been a few months. Everything that money can buy is like that. Everything. Your car, your house, everything that money can buy is like that. But real riches from God is not like that. So let's go to the verse. Verse 6. This is the 1 Corinthians, this is the 2 Corinthians 9 passage now, right? The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, but whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. We want you to sow into real everlasting riches. Not something that will be boring 3 months from now or 6 months after you get it. Okay? And here's how. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart. And we're going to give you a chance real soon to decide. If you're not ready to decide, it's fine, because we're not trying to exact anything out of you, okay? But we want you to decide. And you want to decide not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So we always want you to think about your money, to be generous, but cheerfully, willingly. Here's the other two verses I really want just sitting in your heart. Verse 8. God is able to make all grace abound to you. All grace abound to you. Do you want to have a deeper, more beautiful marriage? That's a grace. Do you want to have children that are close to you and are to each other? That's a grace. Do you want children filled with Jesus? That's a grace. Do you want to have friends? Like, I know that sounds really almost even crazy. Everybody goes, oh, we're going to have friends. But you actually, think how lonely our society is. Friends that last, because your friendship is built on something that's really worthy. So if your friendship is built on, say, football, and then the Niners are no good, kind of like the way they are now, all right, then it's not a fun friendship this year, is it? But if it's built on the glory of God through Jesus, that's a friendship that can last. It's a grace. God's able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. So think about the things you want to do with your life. You want to do something good with your life. You want to wake up each day to do something that matters, right? I hope. And then that would abound. So it has a lot to do with how you think about this money thing. If money is at the center of everything, it's crowding out everything else, how can there be more grace since it's being crowded out? And here's the last verse, verse 11. You will be enriched in every way, to be generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. So I want to close by giving you an example of what enriched could look like. Okay? So I know it feels like I can talk in abstractions. I know you have these desires to have wonderful kids and great friends. I hope you're thinking when I'm 50, 60, 70, 90, you have lots of friends, you're super close to people, and your life has been filled up with grace that abounds. And that you are enriched in every way. And you all know somebody who grew old and they're cranky, they're angry, they're lonely. They even have money. We even know people who have money. So they have money, so they have riches of money, but they're not enriched in almost any other way. Is that a life you want? Would you rather be okay with somewhat less money, but enriched in every way? Jesus did not die so you can have more money. Because Jesus wants you to be enriched in so many ways. That's what the cross is for. So let me close with this example. I had coffee with this brother. His name is Dave Carlson, right? And let me tell you a little bit about his life. Dave Carlson and his wife Becky, they're not famous, but maybe they should be famous. They're unbelievable people. So Dave Carlson is a pastor. He's about my age. And he's from San Jose. So we're not talking about some godly saint from some place in the other side of the world or in history. He's like, you can meet him. Okay, he's a contemporary. He lives in our city. He went to Prospect High School. Becky, his wife, she went to Leland High School, right? And he's a pastor of this church, Neighborhood Bible Church in San Jose. It's on the other side of town. It's like more toward the south, toward Almaden area, right? That's where their church is at. And let me tell you a little something about their life, okay? This is the way they chose to live their life. They said that we love our city, and they don't want to leave, and their loved ones are here. So they're like, it's crazy expensive. First, they decided, I guess we're not going to be able to buy a house. Okay. So that's one decision they made. How do you like that? Here's the next decision they made. They wanted a lot of kids. They had 4 biological children while renting in San Jose. This is how they decided to do it. So most people live in San Jose. 2 is like about the most they'll think about. Maybe 3. They had 4. They had 4 biological children, don't own a house in San Jose, because they're spending their life to be enriched through grace. Okay? And then they decided to adopt more kids. They have 5 adopted kids. So you can do the math. You're smart Silicon Valley people. That's 9 kids. Their adopted kids are age 8. Their biological kids are older. Like, a lot of them are left the house. Their oldest adopted kid is 18. She's Chinese, right? So they have kids age 10 through 18, 5 of them. So let me see if I got this right. I wrote this down. 3 are from China, 2 are from Ethiopia. So I think they went, their 18-year-old is a girl from China. Then they got 2 boys from Ethiopia. Today they're 14. And then they have 2 more kids from China who are today 10 years old. The 3 kids from China were special needs. That's how they chose to live their life. Recently they moved. So apparently they were given below market rent by somebody for years. This is how the Lord provided for them. And then they said, we have to sell our house. So they were like, okay, all right. It had to end at some point. But then somebody else offered them a deal in their next house, and now they're paying rent, but actually their rent goes to a stake in the equity of the home. So somebody saw the way they lived with unbelievable riches and purpose, with 9 children, 3 Chinese kids, 2 Ethiopian kids, 3 who are special needs, and all of them, of course, it's all for Jesus. I actually met his, I didn't know, his son was black. I didn't know he's from Ethiopia. He calls him Dad. He's like, hey, Dad. He calls, it's just like he calls him Dad, right? They have seen so much grace and riches. Now, maybe you don't have to have 5 adopted kids. I personally think, like Dave and Becky, you guys are unbelievable. Okay, we'll just stick with the 1 foster kid in our house, okay? Right? But that's how I got to know him, because he's one of the pastors out of a prayer group of 4 pastors. They started to foster the city. So it's not just that he is living for grace and purpose in his own house. His church planted a movement to love the fatherless. Are doing incredible, beautiful kingdom works. So, Dave and Becky Carlson, maybe you could think maybe I could live something more like them. Maybe? Okay. I'm going to close this message with prayer. And then I'm going to lead us in a time of responsive. I'm going to give you some instructions on how we're going to go do this, this pledge. And then let me invite our praise team to come up as I say this prayer. And you can lead us in some music after I give this instructions. And we'll have a time of responsive prayer before we go to our closing message, okay? Let me pray. Father, thank you for people like Dave and Becky Carlson. When I mentioned to Dave, I asked him for permission to share his story, and I said, these are the verses I want to sow into people's heart. He said, my wife and I love those verses. Of course he knows those verses. He has bet his life on those verses. And boy, is he rich. He and his wife are so rich in incredible ways, with so much love and purpose and joy. And they have seen your riches, your provision. They have seen your grace abound in their lives and abound in their good works. I pray, Lord, that anyone who's listening to this message today at Revive, or maybe even years from now, in our podcast, they would be captured by these verses, and they'd want to maybe live something more like Dave and Becky Carlson, to live for eternal riches, not for things that money can buy, and then we buy them and they're boring 6 months later. Lord, we pray that people will want to live for eternal riches, and we thank you that you give it to us through grace, through faith, because Jesus, you died to make us truly rich. You shed your blood to wash us and free us from the snares and temptations and traps that we are in. In Jesus' name.